Most scholars locate Abraham during the Middle Bronze Age, sometime around the year 2000 BCE. Right around this time, the woolly mammoths took their last breaths, and humans in Turkey were just beginning to learn how to smelt iron. In central Iran, there was a Mediterranean cypress that you can still visit today, the cypress of Abraham, that was already a couple thousand years old when Abraham walked the earth. It is but one of many thousands-year-old plus trees that we find on the planet. Perhaps the oldest is Old Tico, which is a 16-foot spruce that set its roots about 10,000 years ago on a mountain in northern Sweden. In the Fish Lake National Forest in southern Utah, there's a clonal colony of 40,000 quaking aspen, all connected by a single root system that's been regenerating its own stand for the last 80,000 years. It's known as trembling giant on account of the way aspen trees, they have a unique ability. They photosynthesize on both sides of the leaf, which is why they're so quick to flutter and dance in the wind. Trembling giant is the oldest living organism on planet Earth. So what's going on here, we might wonder? How do trees get to be so old? The answer, according to some recent research like that of German forester Peter Wohlleben, has to do with how profoundly socially interconnected trees are. In the undisturbed beech forest that Wohlleben studies in his book, The Hidden Life of Trees, he's found that rather than maximizing individual production, a community of trees tends to synchronize their photosynthesis and growing rates. This leads then to a community in which all individuals are equally successful, regardless of their random start in life. So the forest creates its own social safety net, in a sense. Another example, on their own, a tree is completely subject to whatever the external weather conditions are. But together, trees can create their own microclimate, moderating the extremes of heat and cold, wet and dry. So there's an old saying that's radically, as in to the roots, true. A tree can only be as strong as the forest that surrounds it. Three of the world's major religious traditions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, all trace their roots back to Abraham. He's the only person in Scripture that's described as a friend of God, so he's still looked to as a sort of paragon of faith. So we might wonder, where did Abraham learn such intimacy with God, such that these thousands of years hence, we still find ourselves here in the church as sort of branches and leaves on Abraham's still living tree? What if we were to read Abraham's story from the perspective of trees? Almost immediately when we trace his story, we find that God's appearances to Abraham tended to happen in the presence of trees. It was when Abraham found himself pausing under what Genesis called the oak of Morah that God offered the first major revelation to Abraham that this land would be for his ancestors as numerous as the stars. Abraham knelt down and built his first altar to God under that oak tree. From there, Abraham and his wife Sarah set off exploring the area, and they would set up camp more often than not, again and again returning to a camp that Genesis describes as the Oaks of Mamre. It was likely in a rural spot in the West Bank desert. This was their favorite campsite, and it's the one that we heard about as Jill read, Genesis chapter 18. When God appeared to Abraham again, and in perhaps the most theologically dramatic and decisive way in his life. It's a story in tradition that's known as Abraham and the Three Visitors, or Abraham and the Three Angels, or Messengers of God. This text we heard is the foundational biblical story about hospitality, and it's a theme that then runs throughout the whole Bible. Jesus references it in Matthew 25, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. The letter to Hebrews gives us that beautiful poetic take on it. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing some have entertained angels without knowing it. The Quran, it thinks so highly of the story of Abraham and Sarah under the oak trees that it retells it 3 different times throughout that scripture. So again, we picture Abraham resting under those oak trees, enjoying the microclimate that trees can create. The Talmud, a collection of rabbinical teachings, says that when the three strangers arrived, Abraham was deep in private conversation with God, deep in prayer. But when they arrived, he stopped that conversation and offered them hospitality. This shows, the Talmud argues, that extending hospitality to strangers is even more important than our private conversation with God. Or perhaps I like to think of it this way: extending hospitality to the stranger is the conversation God is always eager to be having with us. So again, Abraham's on the lookout for strangers. He doesn't wait for them to come ask for a glass of water. He goes to them. He runs to them. "Let me get you a bit of water," he says. "Let me bring you a little bit of bread while you rest yourselves under the trees." Of course, that turns out to be a dramatic understatement. Sarah uses 3 days' worth of the finest flour to bake her best bread. Abraham prepares the choicest calf and provides the best dairy, the freshest, squeakiest cheese curds to his guests. So again, we might wonder, since this is the foundational hospitality story, such an extravagant story of hospitality, where or how did Abraham and Sarah learn to extend such a welcome? A traditional answer has been to locate this story within the cultural context of the nomadic desert Bedouin culture. The ancient law of the desert, as it's called, teaches that in such a harsh landscape, such hospitality is a type of social contract, because in any day one could find oneself as the tired, thirsty, hungry wanderer, dependent on the generosity of others. That's a very helpful theory, but I wonder if there's something more going on to this story here than just mere survival. The reason this text has developed into such a strong, deep root for people of faith is that the hospitality they show truly is extravagant. They go above and beyond. They go the extra mile. So again, we might wonder, where did they learn the wisdom of that? I think about those oak trees then that they so love to camp beneath. What might they have learned by living in such close proximity to those trees, the oaks of Mamre? Waking up to the sound of birdsong in the canopy, laughing together as the squirrels tussling in the branches, marveling at that always timeless mystery, how something so small as an acorn turns then into something so majestic as a mature oak tree. From an ecological perspective, trees in general are masters of hospitality, and oak trees in specific have mastered hospitality maybe like no other species of tree. Back a couple. Back a few. There we go. So oak trees as masters of hospitality. Valley oaks in California have been documented to support 300 animal species, 1,100 plants, 370 fungi, 716 lichens, and over 5,000 insect species. So an oak tree hosts 534 different species of caterpillars. For another example, a ginkgo tree, common to plant in urban areas, hosts 5 species, and a chestnut tree hosts only 4. So this type of extravagance quickly extrapolates itself. I've read that it takes 6,000 caterpillars to raise a single brood of chickadees. So birds love oak trees too, as well as all those other wonderful woodland creatures. Genesis 18 that we heard begins a special portion of the Torah called the Vayera. It comes from the first Hebrew word of 18:1. When we read that first sentence of Genesis literally, it reads something like this: "And appeared or brought about being seen to him," that is Abraham, "Yahweh in the oaks of Mamre." Traditionally, this opening sentence is read as a type of dramatic irony, one when the reader knows more than what the characters in the drama do about what's going to happen. In this case, the reader is tipped off or knows that the 3 strangers are actually God's messengers in disguise. But when we linger with that sentence and read it from the perspective of the oak trees, I think a different interpretation shows itself. So read literally, and I don't always advocate that, but in this case, reading that sentence very literally, the scripture says that before God appeared to Abraham as the visitors, God appeared in the oak trees. We might remember here that sacred word in the Hebrew text that's used for God, Yahweh. Although it's translated in our version and in many others as Lord, it's ultimately an unpronounceable name that we can only kind of approximately pronounce through a type of breathing sound. It's often translated as wind, breath, or spirit of life. So Genesis 18, verse 1 says, Abraham sees this sacred wind, breath, spirit of life in the oak trees. I think we can try to imagine the way wind rustles in the leaves of a tree. You can think about how even a gentle breeze can suddenly sort of inhabit a tree and wear it like we wear clothing. We can think about how trees are always breathing in what we breathe out and breathing out what we breathe in, and that sacred exchange of breath that makes life possible. So we can look at the wind in a tree and we can see this is the rhythm of life on our planet. This is God's wisdom that's made visible to us. When we open our eyes to the rush of wind in a tree, we open our eyes to God. And this, the scripture says, is where Abraham sees God first. It's only when he opens his eyes to the presence of God in the oak trees that he's able to see the same presence of God breathing in the three human beings that visit him, thirsty for a glass of water and hungry for a bite to eat. So the oak trees teach us hospitality then, I think, in two ways, both as a type of extravagant abundance and generosity, but also hospitality as a way of seeing the divine presence in one another, seeing the breath of life connecting all things, people, trees, caterpillars, chickadees. So it's October here now, which is a season of painted leaves. And I've enjoyed getting out wandering in the woods some. I hope you all have had a chance for that as well. Oak trees, and often white oak trees, dominate the forests in much of this area, rising tall and straight before they branch out into their leafy canopies that can be all sorts of colors: copper, tan, dusty yellow, burnt amber. Wandering around, there's a type of party of colors above our head, and there's an after party of colors below our feet. I think it's the most dramatically beautiful thing that happens on the landscape here each year, as summer's sea of green morphs and blends and explodes into all this color. We have chrome yellow ash, lemon yellow aspen, yellow orange birch that fill out part of the color wheel. Maples take care of all of those possible shades of orange and red. And the oak trees are a little more unpredictable. They can seem to paint with almost any color that they want to. That all of this beauty is the result of the death of the leaves is deeply stirring, I think. On a light, breezy day, the leaves overhead and underfoot chime back and forth to each other, making a taut, crisp, and confident sound. When I listen, I sense no fear of death in their last words in this leafy postlude on the turning of the year. When an oak leaf lets go of its branch, I picture it as its friendly hand waves goodbye to its siblings up above, as it then flips over and waves hello to its companions waiting below. How beautifully they go to their graves, Henry David Thoreau wrote in the last essay of his life. They that soared so loftily, how contentedly they return to dust again, and are laid low, resigned to lie and decay at the foot of the tree, and afford nourishment to new generations of their kind, as well as to flutter on high. They teach us how to die. When Sarah dies before Abraham does, they purchase a plot of land, scripture says, near Mamre. They purchase both, quote, the field and the cave in it, and all the trees within the border of the field. Abraham mourns and weeps over his wife and then buries her in that cave. Later, when Abraham breathes his last and dies in good old age, as Scripture puts it, he was buried in that same cave, which Scripture then describes as, quote, east of Mamre. And so on one end of that field, I picture the cave, and on the other to the west, the oaks that Abraham and Sarah so loved to camp beneath and learn from during their long and abundant and influential lives. I imagine Abraham chose this spot because he wanted one last view of the sun setting behind those oaks of Mamre, those masters of hospitality at whose feet he studied. I picture the low light highlighting the solid, dark trunk and the bouquet of branches etched against the horizon. The last flickers of the sun dance in the spirit-filled leaves. Abraham wanted a view of the oaks of Mamre because when he died, he wanted a view of God. Amen.